Welcome everyone to the mandatory climate reporting webinar for local government. As you just heard, we are recording this session, so it can be shared afterwards. So if there's any colleagues that you want to pass it on to, we encourage you to do so. Before we get started, I just would like to acknowledge the First Nations people on the land on which we work and live. We're lucky to live in such a wonderful country, and the traditional owners of the land have lived here for a lot longer, and I pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. All right, good morning. There has been a lot of interest in this topic. We've got over 400 people attending, and we're excited to get into this. My name is Paul Brown. I'm the Managing Director at Ironbark Sustainability, and I'll be your tour guide for today, but we have got a lot of guest speakers. So we have Matthew Sullivan and Ankit Kamra, our resident sustainability reporting experts. I've also got Alexi Lynch behind the scenes, who will be popping up lots of links to resources. Obviously, within 1 hour, there's only so much you can get across. So we're going to be providing you with additional links to things that can help you out with this. We have special guests all the way from Blacktown City Council is Nelson Nolan, and from Rockhampton Regional Council is the wonderful Sky Michaels. Exciting to see you all here. And in terms of what we're doing, we're going to be doing a little bit of introduction, housekeeping. We will be doing some emissions reporting 101, so that we can all get roughly in the same ballpark on what we're talking about. But then the majority of the session is focused on reporting requirements, both companies, government, but more importantly, local government. And then we're going to hear from Nelson and Sky on their council journeys around emissions reporting before some last thoughts and into the Q&A. There are a lot of attendees, so please keep yourselves on mute as we're going through this. If you have questions, we encourage you to put them in the chat, and we will endeavour to answer those questions as we go through. There is a Q&A section at the end, so we'll mostly be addressing those. And try and be as specific as you can in the questions so it's easy for us to answer. If we don't get to all the questions, we will follow up and provide answers or contact you to discuss. Why should you turn your camera on? I can see most of you have. Well, it's mostly because it makes us happy. It also makes everyone on the call more engaged and more interested. So please pop on your camera so we can see who is speaking and who we're talking to. All right, before we jump into the details, I want to do a couple of announcements. First one is a couple of big events. In August, there is the Greenhouse Alliances Conference, which is probably the leading local government climate conference of the year. So if you haven't heard about it, jump online. Lex will be putting some links in there of how you get to it. We'll be there with our team and happy to have a chat then, but more importantly, hear from local governments around the country about what they're doing around climate change. The second event is the Better Futures Forum, which is in Canberra. This is brought to you by Better Futures Australia, which includes a local government working group, which is bringing together a lot of key climate networks. You can see some of the links, the logos below there. And the focus is on research, strategies, sharing information and collaborating on behalf of councils. So this forum is going to be one of the key events. In the past, there's been UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Australia's Climate Change and Energy Minister Chris Bowen. So come along there. On the dinner, which is on the Tuesday night, there will be an unveiling of the Australian 2024 Local Government Climate Review, which I know a lot of you have participated in, and this will give you a snapshot of what local governments are doing around the country and what is important to them. That's going to be launched by the Minister for Regional Development and Local Government and Territories, Christy McBain. So come along to that. Last announcement is for those local governments who are, one of their key approaches is climate advocacy. There is a good opportunity in front of you right now. Again, Lex is going to pop a link up into the chat. So this, the Better Futures Australia Local Government Working Group I mentioned earlier, has an invite open to all mayors and councillors to sign an open letter aiming to build community participation in the clean energy transformation. So this is really important at the moment because there are a lot of headwinds. There's a lot of push and concern in some communities around renewables. So it's important that councils are at the forefront of that discussion. The letter will be put up to Chris Bowen, who I mentioned earlier, as well as other decision makers. All right, so into it. About Ironbark. So Ironbark, this is actually Ironbark's 20th year. And since 2004, we have been serving and helping local governments on emissions reduction, whether it's through project delivery of street lighting projects or doing net zero plans at council or community level. We've got around 40 staff who focus on this. And I guess one thing that's really important to us is the health of the sector and helping our local government clients and any local government serve their communities better. It's an awesome area to work in because the tangible impact is really clear and every local government is different with different needs. So it's exciting to be working in this sector. About you. So we had 400 odd registrations. We always do this little snapshot just so you can get a sense of who's who in the room, who's attending here. Some of these charts will be a little bit small. You can get them in the download post this, but what this is telling you is there is a wide range of people from all over the country who are interested in this topic. As I mentioned earlier, this is the largest webinar we've had for a very long time, and it means all of you have connected into the zeitgeist. So well done. You're all on topic and you know what you're talking about and you know what to be interested in. The other thing which I wanted to draw up, which came out of the surveys when you connected in, is that we've got a small number of people who feel they're advanced in climate reporting. There's a small number who have never heard of the reporting standards, but the majority of you feel like you're in the middle. So you've heard about it, you're trying to get your head around it, but there's still a reasonable way to go to understand this. This one was really interesting. We asked the question, what is your council's general attitude to carbon emissions, inventories and actions? And there was a clear majority who said that you saw local government's role as both reducing emissions within your own corporate operations, but also across the community. So as local government practitioners who are interested in sustainability and emissions, it's a very strong preference to look at not just corporate, but also community-wide impacts and risks. So that's going to be a key part of the discussion today and what we talk about. What did you want to know? A lot. What's the answer to that? So as I said, we've got 400 responses to this. I've tried to synthesize this into a very simple summary. The main question is, what is it that councils are required to do as part of mandatory reporting? So we will address that today. The second part is, what does the future look like? Even if it's not mandatory or there's certain things we're not supposed to do now, what will it look like in a year or 2 years down the track? There are a number of people on this call who are from the finance sections of councils who are particularly interested in how does this impact financial reporting? What's our responsibility from a finance perspective? And the last chunk was around procurement and supply chain. So how do we work with our suppliers? What are the implications for us in terms of that extended network of people that we work with for this mandatory reporting? There were a lot of other questions too, but this is sort of a synthesis of that. And some of the other more specific questions, we will deal with them in the Q&A as well. All right, so that's introduction. We're now going to jump into a little bit of background, emissions reporting 101, so that you can all get up to speed. I'm going to start with the difference between corporate emissions reporting and community emissions reporting. So at a corporate level, we are talking about council's operations, the things you are responsible for, waste trucks, street lighting, your aquatic centre, etc. If you want to know more about these emissions, how to reduce these emissions, there's a great guide by Welga in WA, which we're going to pop the link in the chat on. But we're not going to talk a lot about emissions reduction today. We have plenty of times in the past, but that's an excellent tool. At community level, your go-to is Snapshot, Climate, where every year your emissions are identified and updated. Ironbark puts a lot of work into that to make that happen each year. And this year we have 5 excellent local government sponsors who are helping to make sure Snapshot goes up and is updated every year. So Gawler, Cairns, Whittlesea, Whitehorse and Banyule, thank you. And a big shout out to them for their contribution to making sure that information goes live. Knowing what your emissions are is really the start to community emissions management. If you want to know more about community emissions reductions, though, we're not going to talk about this in great depth today. There is an excellent guide that we assisted in preparing for the New South Wales government for New South Wales councils. We're popping a link up for that. If you haven't had a look at that, feel free to jump in and grab that. For the purpose of today, the majority of the discussion around mandatory reporting is at a corporate level. We'll make a little link to community later, but really this is the core element is corporate. All right, emissions reporting 102. To help me with this, we have our resident expert, Matt Sullivan, who is the brain behind Snapshot Climate and also was a supporting author to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for Cities. Matt, we hear a lot of questions about scopes and emissions inventories. Can you explain to us what we are seeing here?
Okay, so I imagine most of the people in this webinar are very familiar with just the words, languages of scopes, and probably very familiar with scopes 1 and 2. So those are the 2 scopes that we see typically reported when we're doing just corporate inventories, or is, for instance, what's reported through Snapshot. So I'll just, what we see is a little bit more complexity when coming to scope 3, and that's really where a lot of the uncertainty is coming from. So stepping through that, scope 1 is emissions that are associated with activities that produce the emissions on site. So that is anything that you're burning. Generally natural gas contributes to that. We can get it from like wood heaters and the like. It's also if you are releasing greenhouse gases through other processes. And so that can manifest through like industrial process and product use, such as refrigerants. Scope 2 is, for Australian context, electricity supplied from the grid. So if you're connected to the grid, you're drawing electricity in, that will have an emissions attributable to it. Scope 3 is the everything bucket. So there's a few different words that are used for describing scope 3 emissions. In particular, a very useful one that's coming into use now is value chain. Value chain is basically a synonym for scope 3. And another phrase that you would probably know is supply chain. So to distinguish between the two, supply chain is everything that's upstream for you, and value chain is everything upstream and downstream. So it's really, you can quite easily imagine what supply chain emissions are going to be. So that's going to be things associated with products that you buy, services that you use, etc. Downstream is a little bit more challenging for many companies. It's often something that's not quite tracked, but essentially it's any of the outcomes of the works that you do. So I would find, yeah, in general, if it's any sort of connection to you indirectly, then it'll be a scope 3 activity.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. I noticed there's that greenhouse gas protocol down there and that you are contributing author. Why does that logo keep coming up when we're talking about emissions reporting?
Sure. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is currently the lead entity for establishing standards in reporting to emissions globally. So most any other framework, approach, etc., will reference this. So when we look at the new standards, climate reporting standards that we're talking about today, that's referencing another international standard from the ISSB, which sets a whole bunch of rules for what it includes. But one of the rules is that it should use this standard for creating emissions reporting. So for creating Scope 3 emissions reporting specifically.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. One thing I will note is that when you fill out the survey on what you thought of the webinar, there is a downloadable report that has this information in it too. So you don't need to remember it all. All right, simplifying jargon 103. I also need help with this. So I have phoned a friend, which is Ankit Kamra, our corporate inventory lead. He helps around 20 to 30 local governments each year create inventories for them. Ankit, what are we seeing here? What is all this jargon we often hear about?
Thanks, Paul. Just to give a context, we heard about 101, 102 in terms of the segregation between corporate and community and the respective scopes. Now, how does this fit across numerous programs, requirements, and rules, which most of you would have seen over the years? Now, what you see on the screen are the rapid increase of these reporting requirements and programs, which have often led to confusion with acronyms flooding around everyone's brains. Fortunately, things are starting to align and consolidate at an international level and in Australian context as well. So most of these jargons or acronyms, which you would have seen over the years, are trying to move towards consolidation. In the Australian context, the federal government has tasked the AASB, which is the Australian Accounting Standards Board, with developing the ASRS, which is the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards. These standards will be relevant for Australia and will be derived from the international standards developed by the AASB equivalent international body. Now, I know this might sound super confusing, but not to worry anymore. You don't need to know all this history. There's consolidation happening at the country level, and we are here to guide you through it.
Ankit, quick question. If a local government has already been reporting under one of these standards, like CDP or TCFD, what do they need to do from here?
Sure, that's a good question. Thanks, Paul. Yes, there are some gaps between mandatory and voluntary disclosure. ASRS, we are talking about mandatory disclosures, but we are seeing a lot of efforts are being made to bridge that divide. So integrating sustainability reporting with financial reporting, which will also help close these gaps and also ensure transparency, accountability, and most importantly, comparability. So we are definitely seeing efforts are also being made to align with and reference other frameworks as far as ASRS movement is going forward. And over the next few years, we anticipate significant changes as mandatory standards expand and more voluntary disclosures integrate with that.
Awesome. Thanks, Ankit. So if you've already been doing reporting, you're well set up to address the requirements under the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards. All right. Now we're going to talk about what is the actual reporting and who is required to do what. I want to start with company reporting because a lot of the noise, so as you mentioned earlier, a lot of you have heard of mandatory reporting and getting your head around it. A lot of this noise is coming from corporate and the requirements for corporate, mandatory corporate reporting in Australia. So this corporate reporting focuses on the largest companies in Australia. Comes in January 1st, 2025, and then over time, smaller and smaller businesses are captured under that reporting requirements. It will be all of the largest companies, probably 5,000 to 10,000 companies in total. A lot of the smaller companies will be captured under this discussion of Scope 3 and value chain reporting. The organisations that are providing services to or receive services from these large businesses will likely be captured in the reporting too, because they'll be asked for information. What are your emissions? What are your plans to reduce emissions? And so this also includes local governments, that reporting to businesses. In terms of governments, at a federal level, the federal government have been doing climate disclosure reporting for departments and agencies for the last year or so. And so this was the first cab off the ranks nationally for mandatory reporting. At a state level, there is varying levels of required and in development. In Victoria, mandatory reporting is required. In New South Wales, Queensland and WA, there are plans afoot to bring in this. They're in the process of understanding how to do mandatory reporting. For local governments, Australian local governments are not required to report yet. There is one exception to that, which is Victorian local governments, who are required to plan for mitigation and adaptation at community level in their decision making. However, something very timely happened in the last month, which is at the ALGA National Conference, there was a motion passed which calls on the Australian government to work with ALGA in leading a process to identify the minimum climate disclosure requirements and reporting standards for local governments. These would only come into effect if they were done so by state governments, but delivering these standards is aimed at short term, so before the end of the year. This was put up by the City of Adelaide. So big shout out to them. This is clearly leadership material. I did speak to David Beals, who's the manager of low carbon and circular economy, on Tuesday. They are one of the leading councils in Australia around climate reporting. And one of their
Adelaide City Council.
Yes, correct. Did I say a different council? So David mentioned that his expectation is that we want to have common standards so we don't get 537 different approaches across the country. So it's important to have those requirements and standards. All right, so in terms of local government reporting, we want to talk about different councils. So there are very different capacities, different abilities of councils to do mandatory reporting and even to action or fund or deliver outcomes around climate reduction and climate risk management. So we've split these into three different. The very first is this expected minimum requirement, which is what we alluded to earlier, which is being able to provide information to your value chain. So that covers emissions inventories. It covers understanding risks and planning for them, and also understanding and managing mitigation or emissions within corporate operations. So these, in effect, are the requirements in Victoria currently for local governments, and we would expect these to be the minimum. Lex is going to pop up in the chat a link to a climate change responsibilities and opportunities, Rural Councils Victoria. This is a reasonable summary of what we think those minimum requirements will look like. In terms of best practice, it's really taking into account what does the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards include. And so the key message here is that it aims to elevate climate reporting to the same level as our finance reporting. So when you think of the finance reporting and the governance structures that are required in your budget deliberations, in deciding how you're going to progress, who makes those decisions, both at executive and council level, how often you report to your community on that, that is the same level that's expected for sustainability reporting. The biggest change around that is really the governance element and that decision making. So this is not a small thing. It's a pretty big thing. And to give you an example, if you're a coastal council, it includes things like considering and understanding the risks associated with sea level rise on council assets and communities, and importantly, quantification of financial impact of that. So this is where the finance sector within council becomes very important, because it's really saying, what are these risks? How do we manage them? How do we plan for them? And what's our financial exposure here? So this is really the core element there for your finance teams, as well as sustainability and council. We would expect the ALGA standards to heavily lean on this, and to be looking at this as it's already referencing the Australian sustainability reporting standards in that motion. In terms of leading councils, this is reasonably simple. It's really helping your community. So working with your community so that they're ready and they can plan for and prepare for emissions reporting. It's leaning into that risk exposure, and it's considering what are the impacts for our whole of community, how can we work with our businesses and support them. This will all keep moving. So this is the current state of play now. 12 months ago it was different. In 12 months' time it will be different. And it'll be good to get clarity around those standards. But at the moment, we're recommending that councils prepare for the expected minimum and best practice as a starting point. Now, that's all background. Now we want to pass over to some local governments. First, we have Skye Michaels, Sustainability Project Officer at Rockhampton Regional Council, who's leading the supply chain work. Skye, do we have you?
Yes, you have me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
All right. Hello, everyone. And yeah, really happy to present today. We are just at the very kind of beginning of our supply chain emissions reporting journey. And there's been a lot of hand-holding from Ironbark, so we really appreciate that. For those of you who don't know Rocky, we are a large regional centre in central Queensland. So we've got about a population of over 87,000. We're known as the beef capital of Australia, and there's a strong connection to the mining and resources sector, but we're also like half an hour from the coast. So also the gateway to the southern Great Barrier Reef and Great Keppel Island. So shameless tourism plug, but lovely part of the world. So looking forward to sharing our journey with you. Thanks, Paul. So just to give you a bit of background and context on this, we adopted our first sustainability strategy back in 2018. So we've been working in this space for a little while. And in 2023, we revised our strategy to have 4 key priorities, and one of them being our transition towards net zero in line with state and federal targets. And we're doing that via our operational services pathway. So you can see it's sort of 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, looking at our net zero emissions by monitoring those and reducing those within our operational control, embedding climate risk considerations. So we're working on climate risk management planning at the moment, and obviously sustainable procurement, circular economy and life cycle principles in the delivery of products and services. Thank you, Paul. So back in 2020, 2021, we enlisted the help of Ironbark to develop our first corporate emissions inventory. So that was really forming the baseline with which to measure our emissions reductions efforts against. So in that top right-hand corner there in that pie chart, you can see that we have a large portion of our emissions coming from our landfill. So I know not all councils have a landfill that they take care of, but we do, and it's certainly a bit of a challenging space. So during that time in 2020, 2021, we also delivered our corporate emissions reduction plan. So that set out our roadmap and our actions that we need to take in order to deliver those, reach those targets. So you can see that sort of outline on the left-hand side is our roadmap. And on the right-hand side, there's that business as usual trajectory. So we definitely acknowledge we've got a lot of work to do in this space and in a fairly short amount of time. So we're currently at the moment at about a 7% reduction on our baseline emissions. So we're getting there, but there's work to be done. So some of our emissions reduction actions have included major solar installations. So the one that you can see there is for our Glenmore water treatment plant. So that's coming online very shortly, or almost being connected as we speak. We've embedded landfill gas flaring into our landfill operations. We've conducted a FOGO trial of over 750 households in the region and trying to get that rolled out community-wide in the coming years. We've obviously implemented energy efficiency upgrades, and recently our environmentally sustainable design procedure into all council new builds and renewals, street lighting upgrades, and we're just beginning our fleet transition planning journey. So we currently have about 7 EVs in our fleet at the moment, but a long process there as well. Thanks, Paul. So yeah, if we think back to that original pie chart in the top right-hand side there, initially we thought that engaging in this sort of supply chain emissions pilot project would help us better understand what that wedge of other emissions is. What are our scope, trying to understand our scope 3 emissions a lot better. But what we've come to realise as part of this is that it's a lot more than that. And it's really about identifying these risks and opportunities that come with the mandatory reporting. So, the risks and opportunities for our suppliers, but also the impacts that that's going to have on us as well. So ultimately that'll improve our scope 3 reporting, and it's going to assist us in helping our suppliers to meet their reporting requirements. So that's part of what this project sort of has been about. We certainly are not, we know that lots of councils are further along in this journey in sort of supporting their communities and leading their communities and local business to reduce their emissions. We're not there yet. We're very much in the space of getting our own house in order. So if you look at that diagram down the bottom, we're very much in that control space and kind of edging towards influence, but we're certainly not there yet. So it's going to be a bit of a journey for us, and we're very much at the early stages, but definitely looking forward to seeing where this takes us. So as part of this project, you can see up on the left-hand side there, we've just sort of completed our preparation phase. So that really looked at mapping our emitter landscape and understanding who the highest emitters in our supply chain are. So we've probably identified about 8 to 10 that we're going to target as part of this engagement project. And what that engagement is going to look like is just basically an introductory letter that's going to acknowledge that we understand the mandatory reporting requirements that are coming, and to be able to identify whether suppliers understand what level of reporting is required on them, and to be able to offer support if we need to. So if they request, if they've never heard of it before, that we can provide resources and links to point them in the right direction, or if they're as part of group 1, they're all across it, they're probably going to give us all of the information that we need anyway. And then moving forward, we'll be looking at embedding our results from the reports and things like that into our annual corporate emissions inventory, and then looking at updating our policy documents as this progresses over the coming years, updating our policy documents, looking at our tender processes, and making sure that we're really embedding these requirements into our procurement processes as well. So as I said, this is a pilot project. We're just starting with a small number of suppliers at this stage, and we don't know what we don't know. So until we get this results back, we'll look at then how we sort of broaden our horizons and engage more suppliers moving forward. So looking at that diagram on the right-hand side, there's probably no surprises there. We've got construction equipment and materials forming most of our supply chain emissions. So yeah, a lot of our suppliers that we're targeting are in that sector as well. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much, Sky. We're
Thank
a
you.
little tight for time, so I might take the questions during the Q&A, but you've had a
No
whole
worries.
bunch of questions, which is awesome.
Thank you.
We are now going to move to the next slide.
Thank you. So in terms of public reporting for us, our annual corporate emissions inventory is very much an internal document at the moment. We do publicly report our annual sustainability strategy year in review every year to council. and that usually comes up around August. So we really sort of measure our progress against the strategy, and we'll be giving a high-level overview of how we're progressing in this emissions reduction space as well, but certainly not drilling down into the detail. But we will be recording the outcomes of the supply chain engagement and understanding our suppliers' sustainability and risk profiles and embedding that into our annual corporate emissions inventory. So we are just at the very beginning stages. We are just kind of positioning ourselves to possibly have to publicly report in the coming years, but just sort of getting our ducks in a row and moving in the right direction. But it's definitely a learning curve, and we really appreciate the support that we've got from Ironbark and looking forward to where this takes us. Like I said, we don't know what we don't know, so looking forward to moving forward. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Sky. We now have Nelson Nolan, the Coordinator of Sustainability and Resilience at Blacktown City Council. Blacktown is one of the leading councils in the country around sustainability reporting. So excited to hear from you, Nelson.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. So yeah, Blacktown City Council. We're on the land of the Darug people in Western Sydney. And we've had a long climate change planning journey. And I'd first like to acknowledge Helen Burney, who's on the call. So she wrote our climate change, responding to climate change policy and strategy in 2018, which set in motion a lot of our work for both climate change mitigation and adaptation and corporate and community climate action work, as well as our CEO. So our CEO, he sits on a number of insurance boards, and his ear was to the ground really early on when it came to some of the initial discussion papers from the Australian Treasury on climate-related financial disclosures. And so he kind of got us thinking about how we can start to meet these requirements really early on, and that's kind of helped us out in terms of where we are now. So I'll first start with why disclose. So as Paul mentioned earlier, this isn't mandatory for local government, but it's certainly something that we can anticipate to come down the road. So I think the number one reason to disclose is to mainstream all of your climate action work. And I know for our team in the environment section, oftentimes working across council with our finance and assets teams can be a challenge as they have a number of priorities, but this is really one of the ways, as soon as you get that direction from your council and CEO and management to start reporting in line with these requirements, it's really one of the ways to start reaching out and bridging across those different sections and making it a really core part of the work that they do and kind of getting them to see the value in looking at climate risk and also meeting certain targets and that sort of thing. In going through the exercise of understanding the requirements, which is really a big effort, and I'm sure that there'll be better guidance coming down the road, we were able to kind of use that process to identify all the gaps that we have in our climate change mitigation and adaptation roadmaps. And so I can walk through that a little bit today, but I would essentially use kind of the requirements as a bit of a guide to see where you're at and where you can get to. And I think one of the really interesting parts of this is around the quantification of climate risk and the costs associated with both inaction and action corresponding to some of your asset management and that sort of thing. So as I said, our journey has been a long one and it's involved a lot of different people, but it really started out with our responding to climate change policy in 2018. And so in that policy, we set out targets for getting to net zero for our corporate emissions, as well as our community, as well as a number of adaptation items. And for Blacktown, it's really around flooding and heat. We also made a climate emergency declaration. That was a great kind of political statement that was quite outward, which accelerated actually some of our community targets to get to net zero. And we also joined a global covenant of mayors kind of as part of that, or as a follow-up to that climate emergency declaration. So then, we started to report. So we've got a really strong base in reporting. We're certified certified carbon neutral. And we've been reporting to Climate Active for a number of years now, as well as to CDP. And so really I found the climate statement work, in particular around metrics and targets, is really closely aligned with some of your public disclosure statement work that you'll have to do with Climate Active. And so yeah, so right now, as of this past year, we did a gaps assessment on how we would meet the disclosure requirements, then drafted a roadmap to our EMC, which was approved, wrote a council report informing our council that we were intending to report, and we're really working on our climate statement now as part of our annual report. And I'll walk through in the next few slides kind of all the components of that climate statement. And yeah, and then in the coming years, we'll just kind of be building really on our climate statement as some of the guidance it becomes more clear for disclosures and potentially as it becomes mandatory. And we've also got a number of really exciting targets that we're meeting. So we've got a PPA for 100% renewable electricity in 2025 that's coming online. We're looking to conduct a technical climate risk assessment and also investigating other reporting schemes. So in terms of translating the requirements to local government, there's a really good guide from the federal government, which has been a great tool. So all states for the federal government are doing a pilot reporting process this year. And specifically page 13 of that guide has all the guidance requirements for those state departments. And so the first thing that I did was look through that guide and say, how does this relate to local government? And what I got from that is kind of these 4 sections. And this was also the structure for the gaps assessment and then roadmap that we put together. So it's really around governance, risk management, strategy, and metrics and targets. And so in terms of governance, it's really about all of the existing enterprise risk management frameworks that you have, how you report to different committees, whether it be your risk committee, that sort of thing, or executive committee. And around risk management, it's about that any kind of risk matrix you might have. If you've done a climate risk assessment, there's a really great tool from state government as well called the climate risk tool, which I can put in the chat. So I've been using that for doing the translating our risk assessment into kind of a risk and opportunities assessment. Strategies is sort of about taking all of your risks and identifying kind of any opportunities or actions that you may want to prioritize. And here you can kind of talk about essentially any resilience plans, climate adaptation plans that you have. And then metrics and targets. So this is the section that really aligns with that public disclosure statement. If you do climate active, or all the stuff that Paul was talking about around your corporate emissions inventory. But it also aligns really closely with any IP&R reporting that you might do and any metrics that you use to track your strategic objectives related to sustainability and climate change. So I'll go through this really quickly because I know we're short on time. But this is a really high-level view of what our roadmap looks like, excluding a number of items. But for governance, we've already got a number of things in place. So we do an annual update on our responding to climate change strategy already. So we're kind of putting that now into an annual report format. We've got a strategic risk register, which is reviewed annually by our executive. We're really trying to now insert climate-related risks into that. We're also presenting to our audit risk and improvement committee. So someone who's been really helpful internally for me is our risk officer, as well as our governance officer. So I'm really trying to kind of leverage those relationships to understand how we currently report on risk to those different executives. Strategies, we've got a number of strategies and plans. So we've really essentially, I'd say for this, it's just about looking at what you already do and identifying some of your gaps. So for us, it's actually around a lot of some of the scope 3 emissions reporting. So that previous presentation by Sky was fantastic, covering that subject. Risk management. So yeah, definitely for this one, just use that tool from the federal government, the climate risk tool. We're looking to kind of start with that this year for our climate statement, but then next year we're looking to do a more detailed climate risk assessment for both our own assets and the community, and then start to embed that into our risk management framework, infrastructure risk management plan, and strategic risk register. And yeah, I think I've already covered the metrics and targets. That's really what a lot of councils already do in terms of their corporate emissions accounting. But I think expanding, if you're going through a process of kind of reviewing your plans and strategies and how they meet the requirements, look at some indicators that can track your progress on those and specific actions in those plans and strategies. And I think that can be added to the metrics and target sections. So yeah, so that's what we've got. In the next couple of months, we'll have made our first climate statement in our annual report. So happy to share that with Ironbark and anyone who's interested. But it's definitely just been a learning experience to this point. So
awesome. Well done, Nelson, and well done to Helen and the rest of the team at Blacktown. It's obviously a lot of work, but it sounds like you're well progressed, and it's really helping shape up the whole organisation to understand risks and reporting and plans. You can shoot through that when you do the next annual plan, shoot it to us and we'll circulate it. Okay, we're going to move on to a few last thoughts before we open up to Q&A. The first thing I will do is quite dense, and I would encourage you to download the slide pack after this, but we did promise to talk about who is responsible for what within local governments, which departments. So this chart draws out a number of the key tasks under the different strategies. So whether it's expected minimum, best practice, or leading. Of these, sustainability is a core player in all of the reporting requirements. Finance, as mentioned earlier, is really a key player in monitoring and reporting climate risk, as well as communicating and supporting that communication through the council. Obviously, council itself is a key player in that council decision making. One thing I will note is that there is a large difference here between councils and corporates around decision making and governance. Obviously, at a corporate level, you can headhunt someone who knows a lot about climate risk to your board or subcommittees if you need. Local government are democratically elected, and so the lift from executives and staff around this is there's a lot more work required. The other key player is procurement. There's a number of areas which procurement would be engaged in, from updating procurement requirements through to support in the supply chain work, so working with your suppliers, and economic development around how to support businesses broadly across the community. These are sort of the minimum touch points. There are obviously 101 other players. There's a lot of people in different departments we haven't mentioned, but this is a reasonable guide to that minimum requirements within each local government, who's who in the zoo. If you're starting, we would strongly encourage you to start at that expected minimum. So get your inventories organised, get your mitigation and adaptation planning in train, if you haven't already. If you're already at that level, start thinking about what best practice looks like. All right. I want to briefly touch on leading councils and community. For leading councils, we've already talked a little bit about some of these resources, Snapshot and the New South Wales Guide on community emissions, and you can give us a chat, give us a call at any point. I want to draw Matt Sullivan back in again on the link between this reporting and community emissions. Given that you all noted that we're not in it just for corporate emissions, we're also interested in how we can work with our community. Matt, can you explain this delightful graph that you have produced?
Sure. So a couple of you might have seen this before. It's an area that Ironbark's been working on recently. As you would know, Ironbark's very focused on how to create the most effective strategies for local governments to target effective action across your communities. One of the key areas we've been focusing on at the moment is how to leverage investment happening from the private sector. So this graph here is an output that maps the collated impacts of large emitters within a specific municipality aggregating their commitments to emissions reductions above and beyond the business as usual trajectory, and then sort of examining how that alters the trajectory of emissions for this specific municipality. There's a couple of different breakouts we've got here. So the red dotted line is what the current projected BAU trajectory is for the municipality, taking into account things such as changing coefficients for grid supplied energy and adoption of EVs. We've then got a green wedge there, which is of the 29 largest emitters identified for this specific municipality, the 15 that had established commitments have that green wedge allocated there. So that's their contribution. And then for the light and dark blues, they are where a further 14 identified emitters have the potential to increase their commitments and what those impacts are. So for the dark blue, it's where they've light blue, it's improving upon existing commitments, and dark blue for organizations that have no such commitments. Now, the reason we did this exercise is because we think that a big blind spot for local government in planning community level action is that it's not recognizing, incorporating, and leveraging the very large amount of resources that are available to all the different large and medium-sized stakeholders across the community. Not least, creating two problems. One, a lot of that effort is taking place, and when we plan and make our plans without that in mind, we're likely to misalign resources and potentially overlook potential engagement. And secondly, this is a really effective lever of change. So when we look at all the different options available to councils, this is potentially shaping up to be one of the most effective possible vectors of engagement we've identified. So that's kind of like what we're saying is, like, with this rollout of the new standards, creating a vector of engagement for the local community, we can see that there's actually a really good alignment between this outreach and providing sort of service and encouragement and facilitation for local businesses, but very much so to be able to reach mitigation goals for your broader community.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt, for drawing that link between the sustainability reporting and that emissions reduction at community scale. And also working beyond councils, you start to multiply those emission reductions. So awesome. I am going to want to move into Q&A very quickly. Before I do so, you'll note a jot form there, which is a survey on the webinar, what you found useful, what you'd like to have improved. If you click on that, you will also get access to a resource that we've put together on inventories and supply chain, which I did mention earlier so that we didn't have to go into too much detail. So feel free to jump on, post this, and go for it. Now I want to jump straight into Q&A. There's been a number of questions in the chat, so please feel free to keep putting those in the chat. And there were a lot of questions that came before the session. So without further ado, there was one question. There's a number of questions there for you, Sky, which I've noted that you have been answering as we've been going. Thank you for doing that. Is there anything you wanted to talk about in those answers, or are you happy with your responses?
Yeah, look, I've tried to answer them as best I can. I think the thing to take away from this is that we are working down our emitters list, that we've started with our top emitters and engaging with them. So our first kind of 8 to 10. And like I said before, we don't know what we don't know. So until we get that information back from them as to what their exact emissions reporting looks like, if they even have it at all, I'm assuming those top level ones will, that will sort of affect how that gets the data that we report on in our inventory. And then we will be looking to expand our engagement with further suppliers down the track, but we're just at the very beginning. We're just at the very top of our emitters list. So like I've said, we're kind of we'll be very interested to see what the results are from the survey that we send out. How prepared are they for the mandatory reporting? What kind of emissions reduction plan, sustainability strategy, climate risk management, what are their plans in place? We're asking them all of those questions, and to build a bit of a sustainability and kind of risk profile, but also embedding that scope 3 data into our emissions inventory. So yeah, I wish I could answer them better, but that's kind of where we're at the moment.
Awesome. Thanks, Guy. I did note there was a question from David Mickle-John. as to whether the 8 to 9 suppliers, what percentage of emissions. So what we've seen for most councils that we've done this for is it's around half. So the top 10 is around half.
Yeah.
And so the next 100 are probably equivalent to the top 10. So top 10 is a pretty good initial target, but it's not necessarily the top 10 that you spend money with. So it depends on the sector they're in. It depends on their emissions exposure. And so you really need to do that work to understand what the emissions are for that particular organisation. We have some pre-questions as well. So one of the pre-questions was, what does verification mean? This is probably a quite engaged question, because all of the standards say inventories, for example, must be verified. Ankit, I might throw to you. Can you tell us what do they need for someone who is verifying an inventory?
Sure, thanks for the question. Verification for an inventory can and may involve an independent assessment to confirm the accuracy and completeness of the reported data, although it depends on framework to framework, but usually the process ensures that the inventory is reliable and credible, and ideally it should be performed by people who have that sort of appropriate training and expertise in the accounting and reporting standards. So it could be, for example, Ironbark staff who have already completed multiple inventories over the last few years. We also expect some of those requirements getting evolved over the next few years pertaining to ASRS and related standards.
Okay, so as long as someone's got the adequate training, then that can be a verification for the purpose, certainly for the purpose of ASRS. There is a comment from Mara. I'm wondering if it would be useful to compile a list of councils who are already reporting under TCFD, etc. I will make the comment that Climate Active actually publish councils who are officially certified through Climate Active. So there is a de facto list, at least at Climate Active level, of those who have been certified. As far as I'm aware, there's about 20 thereabouts in Australia for Climate Active. But Matt or Ankit, do you want to add whether there's any other lists, or whether it's a good idea to share this? Give it to me in 10 seconds.
I think that's a great idea.
It's a great idea. I think the move towards standards and just sort of sharing knowledge and practice is a really excellent move.
All right, we'll take that offline and see what we can do about that. What else have we got here? So Michelle's asking for some completed reports, particularly addressing physical risks and valuation, management, insurance of assets. Nelson, I might hand to you. Do you, in terms of Blacktown's journey, I know you have done some reporting through your annual report. How much do you think is going to get into a public report around those physical risks and valuation?
Yeah, really good question. So I think a good example would be the state of Victoria. So they did a disclosure statement in 2022. That's a good reference just for format. But then in terms of physical risks, so that's something we're actually looking to really build on. And so essentially we'll be taking our asset inventory, and under 2 different climate scenarios, we would assess the potential risk under different hazards to that infrastructure. And from there, we're hoping to kind of embed our understanding of the risk profiles to our infrastructure into our asset management plan. And so I guess that would be part of a bigger process of doing some sort of climate change adaptation or resilience plan. But from what I've investigated, that can be costly analysis to do. So it can be anywhere from 80,000 to 150,000, and that's just a very ballpark estimate. But yeah, unfortunately, that's kind of all the information that I can provide at this point. So
awesome, thanks, Nelson. We are fast running out of time. And so I'm going to jump onto the thank yous. For those that we haven't responded to, we will reach out or provide responses to all the questions. If you have questions afterwards, please feel free to contact us. I want to thank Nelson and Sky in particular. You guys are awesome and doing awesome work. Well done. Thanks to Matt and Ankit and all the team at Ironbark. Lex, your keyboard fingers were very fast, putting all the links in the chat. And thanks to all of you for your work and your interest in this topic. It's really important, and can't wait to see what happens over the next year or two on this. We'll no doubt be bringing more information as it comes to hand. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.